Metamorphosis is a biological process by which organisms undergo significant changes as part of a necessary period of growth. It is intense, it is uncomfortable, but only through this process can one mature and become something more. My name is Nina Yoshida Nelson. I am a mezzo-soprano. I am a co-founder of the Asian Opera Alliance, and I am an artistic advisor at Boston Lyric Opera. I have performed the role of Suzuki from Puccini's Madama Butterfly well over 150 times, and I am also thrilled to be returning this fall as we get ready to bring Madama Butterfly back to the stage. Through this process, I have gathered colleagues from across the Asian American community to explore the complex and sometimes sticky cultural narratives surrounding Madama Butterfly. Join me as we explore together, grow together, and discover a new butterfly, one with wings to stand the test of time. I often ask the question, how do we know we can succeed if we've never seen anyone like us that has succeeded before? If we don't have a blueprint for success, do we know that anything is possible? I really think that representation matters. One of the most viral videos this week has been Black little girls reacting to the trailer of The Little Mermaid. Every time I watch them, I think about how exciting it is for them to see someone who looks like them as a Disney princess. If we don't see ourselves, how can we know it's possible? Asians in the opera world in the United States, there are only a few of us. If you've got the voice type to sing in Butterfly, you probably have sung together, or at least you're once removed from someone that you've sung with. For example, I worked with the same Asian soprano in 3 different operas last year. In fact, in the general opera world, all of us combined, I'd say we're no more than twice removed. This podcast is a little glimpse into not only the backside of our industry, but also what it's like to be an opera singer. We literally pack up our lives for 4 weeks and we move to a different city. We start rehearsals, having potentially known our colleagues and potentially not. And by the end of the first day, we're living together, eating together, working together, and very, very quickly we become friends and sometimes even family. It's a small community. Interestingly enough, I've heard about today's guest for many years. Somehow we're about the same age, yet our paths have never crossed in our industry. I've always admired him from afar. He's got a brilliant blog where he discusses current day issues that are sometimes sticky, but really important to talk about. He is the co-founder and artistic director of the Collaborative Arts Institute of Chicago. He has a thriving career as a concert artist. He's commissioning music. He is creating what we want the future of classical music to be. It's so easy to listen to his tenor voice. It just soars and it's absolutely incredible. When I started Asian Opera Alliance, someone said, "You have to meet our guest for today. He's brilliant. He's always urging me to push further and harder. And he is one of the most supportive people I know." Today's guest is Nicholas Phan. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, what an introduction. Great. I feel like you're always pushing all of us to do better and push further. And you're
Oh, thanks.
inspiration. So
Oh,
anyway,
thank you.
thank you.
This podcast is, as we know, for Atlanta Opera, and I know that you have worked at Atlanta Opera in the past. I'm wondering if you would tell me a little bit about your career trajectory and where Atlanta Opera fits into your career.
Sure. So I think my debut with the Atlanta Opera was shortly after I finished my young artist program at the Houston Grand Opera in the Houston Grand Opera studio.
Mhm.
I had the opportunity to be a part of a production that was the first half was Pagliacci, and the second
Hmm.
half was Carmina Burana, a staged Carmina Burana,
Wow.
which
That's an
was
interesting combination.
yeah, it was an interesting combination. It was a very cool production, and the idea was that in the Pagliacci, Nedda and Silvio die, and then at the beginning of Carmina, they become resurrected, and they become the soloists for the Carmina. And Beppe ended up singing the little dying swan bit in Carmina, which was kind of fun because I got to be lifted up by a bunch of really gorgeous looking dancers and pretend that I was dying this agonizing death as I sang stratospheric notes.
Oh my goodness.
And then I came back a couple seasons later to do a production of Cenerentola with
Hmm.
Jennifer Larmore.
Huh.
And then I came back a few years later, I think in 2012, to do a production of Don Giovanni. I had the privilege of being Don Ottavio in a very
Mm.
it was a fun cast of people, and we had a great time. The Atlanta Opera, in terms of just the trajectory of my career overall, it's one of the only opera companies where I've had a chance to do a role like Don Ottavio. In fact, I think the only time I've performed Don Ottavio complete in a staged production is at the Atlanta Opera.
That's just crazy to me.
Yeah, me too. Because I mean, it went very well, and the Mozart roles also sort of feel like they should be bread and butter for me. But it's interesting.
Mhm.
I've only been cast in those Mozart operas each one time, and
Wow.
I don't think that's because of my abilities, obviously, because I've
Yeah.
gone on to continue to do wonderful things. Um, it was one of the only places when I was really focused on doing opera in my
Mhm.
career that afforded me a chance to do standard rep roles that were not race specific.
So you kind of hinted at it. You said it's not because of your abilities, which I totally agree. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think it is because of that you have not been cast in these roles?
Again, like there are so many factors that go into these things, but I do think
Mhm.
that it's hard for me to shake that idea that it's not that it's a factor. Do you know what I mean? That race is a
Right.
factor because in the
Right.
way careers play out. And I it was some early formative experiences for me that really kind of lodged that in my brain and
Hmm.
opened my eyes to that perspective. And one of them was when I was very early on, and I mean, I was a student. I was looking to
Mhm.
apply for a master's degree, and I was trying to find a new teacher. I was
Mhm.
trying to use teachers as a way to kind of guide that decision. And I
Right.
remember coming out to take a lesson. A friend of mine who was a Chinese American soprano was studying with her. She
Mhm.
introduced me to her and brought me to her lesson, or brought me
Mhm.
to her lesson. I watched her lesson, and then I had my own lesson. So, my friend is sitting right there on her couch. And at the end of
Mhm.
the lesson, Nina asked me, "You're half Chinese and half what?" And I said, "My mother is Greek American."
Mhm.
And she said, "What is your mother's maiden name?"
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, my mother's maiden name is, blah." And
Mhm.
she said, "Hmm." And she started like trying out my first name with my mother's maiden name.
Hmm.
And she said, "I think you should change your name."
Hmm.
And I said, "Oh, okay." And she said, "I think you should change your name because it's going to be to your advantage when you're applying for competitions and also auditioning for things, because when people see your name, they're not just going to assume that you're just another dumb Asian singer."
Wow.
And being 21 years old and like
Mhm.
kind of leaving the nest for the first time in a way, because I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Michigan. So I really hadn't left home yet.
Mhm.
I was really, I kind of wrote it off as like, oh, this woman is a wingnut.
Right.
But I did file the information away. And then, a year later, I ended up not studying with her, obviously, because I thought, why would I study with this woman? And when I was in the opera studio program as a master's student for the 1 year that I
Mhm.
studied, there were a lot of Asian singers in that program with me. And on the
Right.
one hand, it was the first time, because I was coming from the Midwest, that I was surrounded by a lot of fellow Asian singers. And
Mhm.
that was exciting to me. And it also showed me the diversity of Asian experience. It really opened my eyes to that because,
Mm.
here I was, an Asian
Mhm.
American and who's also mixed, working with Asians
Mhm.
from Asia, as well as Asian
Right.
Americans who, had a very different experience from mine growing up in the East Coast or wherever, in different parts of the country.
Mhm.
And I watched the way some of those colleagues got treated, particularly the ones who were
Mhm.
from overseas. And
Mhm.
they were spoken to like they were stupid, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
And they were talked down
Wow.
to, and they were treated with impatience and disrespect. And
Mhm.
I was appalled at that.
Hmm.
And there were
Yeah.
times in
Yeah.
rehearsals I remember having to sit with my colleagues because we'd be staging a scene, and I would have to say to it was a rough rehearsal for that person, and I would have to say,
Mhm.
you're great. And I'd find myself being in the
Hmm.
position of having to build up my colleagues so we could finish the rehearsal or make it to the next one.
Mhm.
And
Wow.
so again, that stuck with me. And then, I went on, and after a year,
Hmm.
I was invited to join the opera studio right after that. Being there too, it was interesting. Suddenly, I did not see very many Asian singers coming through. But I also noticed there was one season where, you know, there were three tenors in the studio. All of us are lyric tenors. But
Mhm.
I was cast as Goro in Butterfly. I was cast as a role called El Chino in a world premiere by Daniel Catan called Sal Si Puedes, where I played
Mm.
a generic Asian street vendor. And
Yeah.
I was cast as Pong and Turandot. So all in the span of
Hmm.
12 months. By being pigeonholed into those roles, it limited my opportunities elsewhere. That's how I experienced that early on. And it's something I really chafed at. Especially
Yeah.
the Goro experience was really something that showed me that it's a unique set of challenges that I noticed my white colleagues were not facing. Because here I was
Mm.
cast in this role because I was the young artist in the program, and they got an
Right.
Asian guy who can play Goro, and it was a very frustrating experience because my skill set does not lend itself to that role,
Right.
because I was training to be a different kind of tenor. I started every audition with
Right.
Don Ottavio or Belmonte or,
Mhm.
Tom Rakewell.
Especially as a young artist where you're just starting out and you're trying to create a career for yourself. And it's not like we necessarily even have any um, uh, career security, right? We go from opera company to opera company to opera company. So if you're speaking out at an opera company saying something, you may never be hired there again.
Yeah.
So as a young artist, you're especially taking care with what you say, and how people react.
Yeah, 100%. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, it's hard to think that. I mean, race does play a factor in the way these things unfold, and because I was having those
Mhm.
experiences early on, and I just really chafed at it early on, and this is 20 years ago now. I worked really hard to overcome that, and one of the ways that I was able to do that at the time was I was able to kind
Mhm.
of navigate rather. I was able to sort of fit myself into a very virtuosic space, which in the end I don't
Mm.
think is really for me. It allowed those were the opportunities to kind of do the non-race specific stuff, and
Mhm.
in the end, that also I found really frustrating because Rossini, True Confessions, only you and
Mhm.
I and everybody listening to this podcast will now know that Rossini gives me a rash.
It does me
I
too.
mean, I really respect it and I admire it, and I'm always in awe of like
Yeah.
what our colleagues who sing it really well do with it, but
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
not for me. I was able to do that, and then I started burning out a little bit, and then I miraculously found myself at the Marlborough Music Festival, which is a chamber music festival,
Mhm.
and that's where things really
Right.
changed for me, and
Yeah.
that's where I got there that summer, and it's a very special place where you have a chance to kind of retreat, and there's no pressure to
Mhm.
perform. You can all you're there to
Hmm.
do is rehearse, and if you choose to perform, you can,
Wow.
which most people inevitably do because you
Wow.
work so hard on these things.
Right.
But while I was there, you know, being back in a chamber music space, like that really touched on my musical soul from my instrumental days. It also reminded me of my
Mhm.
teacher didn't start me in college on opera arias until I was a sophomore or junior. So it reminded me of those early days of being in college when I was like, I want to
Yeah.
be a singer and nothing else. And
Right, right.
it really reconnected me with that. And so that's where things really shifted. And that's where I suddenly realized I was going to try and, I don't know, steer the ship a little bit differently.
I'd like to take the conversation back to Atlanta Opera and to casting, this idea of casting. Um, CAIC just finished a fall festival. Is that what you might call it? And I looked at your website, and what I saw was this beautiful rainbow of diversity. And I know that, it was mainly you who put this all together. And casting can be difficult. I know it can be. And when we look at Atlanta Opera's casting of the Butterfly they're doing this season, we are doing this season, you have a Japanese woman from Japan singing Butterfly. You have me, half Japanese American woman, singing Suzuki. A Korean man singing Goro. You have a black man singing Yamadori. A black man singing the Imperial Commissioner. Talk to me a little bit about what you think about this type of casting, and if it were up to you, how would it look different or the same, and why?
The casting question is so difficult. In the opera house, it really, there's so many factors that go into play. And a story like Butterfly presents a lot of quandaries, right? Because it's a
Mhm.
race specific story that is
Mhm.
about colonialism.
Mhm.
And, if you're casting it and you're building a production of Butterfly, there are a lot of questions that arise. Are you going
Mhm.
with a quote unquote traditional casting, and are you going to cast race specific in order to, for the sake of verisimilitude in terms of
Mhm.
the storytelling,
Right.
or are we going to be more imaginative and you know lean into the fact that this is opera and that we're already
Mhm.
suspending a sense of disbelief because people are singing the entire time at the top of their lungs. I think those are decisions that have to be discussed in the casting
Mhm.
room.
Mhm.
And, what I appreciate about this kind of casting is that there's a mindfulness to it in a way,
Right.
that
Right.
it's,
It's intentional.
yes, there's an intention, at least from the outside, it seems that there's an
Mhm.
intention that we will cast a diverse cast of people. It sort of strides that line of, race specific and not race specific. And when we choose to not be race specific, we will give opportunities to other singers who come from marginalized groups.
Right, right.
So I think there's a lot that's to be praised there and applauded. And I think that
Mhm.
that's really exciting. The trouble is
Yeah. Yeah,
with
yeah, do
this
tell.
is that,
Uh-huh.
like we were talking about at the beginning,
Mhm.
for each of these artists, if the opera company does not commit to these artists for a different production
Mhm.
of something or a different role that is not race
Mhm.
specific,
Mhm.
it runs the risk of being tokenistic
Right.
because then you've just pigeonholed people. And while it's great that they have the opportunity to work and be on stage,
Mhm.
it's very it's a limiting factor that non-white colleagues don't have to grapple with.
Right.
I'm sorry, that white colleagues that don't have to grapple with.
That yeah, 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 yeah. I remember when I first started in this realm of equity and inclusion, and someone mentioned to me that pigeonholing is a form of racism, and I had never even considered that before. And I was like, oh my gosh! I sat back and I was like, yeah, you're right. It is. You're only seeing someone for their race, and a lot of times, a lot of my fellow Asian American singers say, yes, that's who I am, but also, and I'm also so much more. And, I was having a really interesting conversation with someone the other night who said to me, I just feel like we just have all these boxes to check now. And if you don't check the box, you're going to get in trouble. And I said, I said to this person, I said, that is, sort of how it feels right now. But flip it around and take a look at those of us who are those boxes being checked. How do you think we feel? It can't just be about checking boxes. It's like, yes, and.
Right. I mean, I think the danger is that people are always looking for easy answers, and there just is no easy answer to unpacking this
Hmm.
history and to bringing this art form into a place where it is uplifting as opposed to hurtful.
Hmm. Yeah. So that brings me to this idea of a lot of Asian Americans have an issue with Madame Butterfly when it goes on stage and there are no Asians in the cast. It's really interesting because I feel like Asian singers have less of an issue with that being the fact than our audience members. Um, what do you think about that?
I would love to say that we're there
Right,
and we're just not
right,
there, you know? I mean,
right, right.
people people's first defense is like, "Oh, we just want to cast the best singers." And the
Mm-hmm.
voice should lead
Yeah,
an opera. But like that's not been true for a long time. People have been fired because they can't fit into the black dress. They have
absolutely.
not been cast because, they don't look right for whatever. I mean, it's
Where they're shorter than the soprano or whatever.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and it's I mean, there's so many factors that go into it that have nothing to do with the voice,
Mm-hmm.
and that have to do with judgments of character too. Like, is this
Mm.
person, I've heard people discuss casting and it's like, I just don't think that person is
Hmm.
Elvira. And it's like, what does that even
Right.
mean? Like, our job is to act. In a time when opportunities and implicit biases are so strong, involved,
Mm.
like in regards, opportunities are so limited and implicit biases are so strong in regards to Asians and Asian American singers,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot take away the few opportunities that, you know, make the most sense, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And we need to empower and lift up those singers and give them opportunities in other non race specific roles. My thing about this from the singing perspective is that
Mm-hmm.
the hoops that we have to jump through in order to get on stage involve us
Mm-hmm.
singing standard repertoire, right? You have to
Right.
put together a package of arias, and the casting directors want to see that you've got a Mozart on there, you've got so many different languages, and they want you
Mm-hmm.
to represent so many different time periods in terms of style. And then the only thing that you're being cast for and considered for are productions of Butterfly and the role of Suzuki.
Yeah.
That's not the same as what a white singer has to do. A white singer sings all those
Yeah.
same things, and it's like, oh, we could cast her as Carmen, or we could cast her as Dalila, or we could cast her as Amneris. The gatekeepers who are, you know, creating these opportunities, whether they be
Mm-hmm.
companies or panels of people or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
if they're not mindful of that in terms of the commitment that they're making to artists who are coming from marginalized communities, then we really do run into trouble about being tokenistic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is something that's really important for opera companies as we're moving forward to keep thinking about this idea of we need to make sure that for future generations, we are lifting up everybody and not just certain people because we think that they are, quote unquote, the chosen one or whatever, right? Um, so as we are moving forward, I'm curious to see where you see our art form going. Something that's really interesting to me is that, recently I have been contacted and people are saying, "Well, because you are Asian, we think that we want you to do this," in this idea of trying to diversify castes and whatnot. And it's because I'm Asian that I am, quote unquote, diversifying this caste. And that's kind of where we are right now in this fight for equity. Where do you see it going and how do you see it changing?
I I'm hopeful that we're heading to a place where we can move from, I mean, this is, I don't know that we'll ever get there, but I think the goal is
Mm,
to be able to move from a race conscious mindset in terms of an equitable standpoint, race
mhm,
consciousness, and with the idea of pursuing equity,
mhm,
moving from that to truly equitable, where we can then be race blind and just
mhm.
view people as individuals and humans. And
Yeah.
that is my, that would be my dream, I think.
Mhm, mhm,
I think the art form has some very important questions to ask of itself. And I think it is asking
mhm,
it of itself in a way. The first one is, what makes opera opera? In the
mm,
sense
mhm,
that, is it the voice that leads the casting?
mhm,
Or is it all of these other factors that lead the casting?
mhm,
Right now, people think they have a clear answer, but it is so obvious that they don't. So that's one question I think that is a really fundamental one that the that opera as an art form needs to ask itself, because
mm,
it's a
mhm,
self-defining one, and it's one that, I don't know, we've been sort of straying away from this idea that the voice leads the casting
mm,
for a long
mhm.
time now. I mean, in terms of
Yeah.
size, in terms of a whole, mostly
Mhm,
size, but a whole
mhm,
slew of factors.
mhm,
And I think the other question is this art form for everyone?
mm,
I believe it is and can be. It's a place where, as someone who grew up feeling like they were living on the outside and isolated, it's a place where I found community. It's a
mm,
place where I
mhm.
found myself and self
Yeah.
acceptance. And it's a place that, music in general is something that is, I do not think it's an exaggeration to say that it saved my life many times. It saved me
Mm,
from self harm many times,
wow.
because it's the thing that gave me a place of belonging. And it's
Yeah.
changed my life in myriads of ways continually over the course of this 4.5 decades right now. And so I believe it is for everyone, but it's hard to
Mhm,
ignore how the traditions and
mhm,
the institutions exclude and can be harmful and can be
mhm.
destructive. And
Yeah.
if we really do believe that opera is for all, which is, I feel like that's a marketing slogan I've seen at least
Mhm,
at
yep.
one opera company. If
Uh-huh.
we really believe that, then we really need to make it so. And so I think that's the other thing that we need to kind of grapple with in the art form in terms of ensuring that it has a future.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I see opera companies, coming up with new strategic plans and whatnot, I find that community is a word that is coming into the conversation now, which maybe hasn't always been a part of the conversation before, but this idea of community and what that creates, I think you're absolutely right in that this is one of the next steps for opera is making sure that our communities are open to everybody and that we're including everybody as we move forward.
And that we're serving our communities.
Absolutely.
I mean, if we're all arguing that we are charitable nonprofit non-for-profit institutions, we need to be serving our
Mhm.
communities, and we do that. You know, telling the stories of our communities and telling stories of
Mhm.
humanity is a
Mhm.
really important service to humanity. And
Mhm.
we have to keep in mind that that is always ultimately the goal.
Yeah. There's nothing like finishing a concert or an opera and that, 10 seconds of quiet before all the applause, and you can feel everybody's um, the 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 way that opera has touched everybody in that audience. And that feeling is one of the best feelings in the whole wide world.
It is. And it's such a communal silence, right? That and
Mm.
even and then when the applause erupts, that's also communal, it's
Mhm.
or if you're in an extreme situation and people are booing, that is also communal. But I think, it's interesting as we have as we talk as an industry about increasing, diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Mhm.
and increasing our cultural competency, which is so funny because we are cultural institutions. It
Mm.
it reminds me, it feels like a very divisive conversation, and in the political discourse at large, the conversation around these topics is really feels very binary, and it's very us against them. And
Mhm.
the the important thing, I think, that we have as artists and as art makers in the,
Mhm.
as in the opera world, is that we have a chance to call people in.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that ultimately has to be the goal. Our goal
Mhm.
has to be winning hearts and minds, and like, what better way to do that than with singing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I thank you for being here with me today and having this really interesting discussion. It fascinates me to hear about other singers and their paths and how they got to where they are today. So I thank you for being with me here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Metamorphosis, a limited series from the Atlanta Opera Podcast. The executive producers are Tomer Zvulun and Ashley Marakian. Matt Dykman is the producer and editor. I am your host, Nina Yoshida Nelson. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way for more people to find our content. And be sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date on new releases from the Atlanta Opera Podcast. The Atlanta Opera's production of Madama Butterfly runs November 5th to the 13th at the Cobb Energy Performing Arts Center in Atlanta, Georgia. You can purchase tickets for any performance at www.atlantaopera.org/tickets. If you are unavailable to join us in person, you can experience the live stream of this production from anywhere on Friday, November 11th, only on Spotlight Media. Learn more at stream.atlantaopera.org.